So I'm gonna read a poem that I wrote on PTSD. This was written, actually, it was published in August 11, so 4 days before the Kabul collapsed, and it is um, just a short conversation framed between a mom and a daughter. And the mom is recalling everything that has happened in previous um, um, Taliban government during the between 1996 to 2001. So it's titled Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, PTSD. Last night, the nightmare of terror knocked at our door again. Drowning in sweat, she woke up screaming. They beheaded your brother just like your father. I ran to save him, but I failed. I failed again. Like angry wolves, they came at me. There are lashes marks all over my body. Look at all these bruises. Look. She rolled up her sleeves in the darkness with teary eyes. I felt the warmth of her shaky hands. Years after the Taliban regime, the possibility of their return has set up tents in our dreams like nightmares. I rolled up her sleeves and gave a kiss on her forehead. She laid her head on my shoulder. With a broken heart and a tired soul, she whispered, "Darling, peace will come, but not with its enemy, the Taliban."
You're listening to Calling Others. Calling Others is a podcast miniseries featuring the stories of young Swana American creatives and advocates. This podcast is a little reminder. Our personal stories matter. They have more power over politics than we realize. I'm your host, Nastar Anfar, and this episode's guest is Zahra Wakilzada. Zahra is a current university student, a published poet, and a war survivor, refugee, and immigrant of Afghan descent. Zahra is also a writer at Free Women Writers, a writing collective composed of Afghan women. In this episode, we talk through Zahra's path to writing, her effort to balance competing identities by asking questions like, what does it mean to be an Afghan American? And the role of poetry and language in people-driven social justice, policy, and politics, and more. Here's our conversation in today's episode.
My name is Zahra Wakilzada. The American version of it is Zahra Wakilzada. That is something that I have had as part of my identity since October of 2015 when I stepped in JFK as a refugee. Um, it's still a struggle to be able to introduce myself in the same manner that my grandma would call my name. And it is a constant battle to be able to actually have people roll their tongue and call me in the same manner that would feel like home. I am a refugee. I became a refugee when I was 13 to Pakistan from Afghanistan, and I was brought to United States with my family, my immediate family, at the end of 2015 by UNHCR. Um, Growing up in Afghanistan, it was a very difficult time in terms of finding peace and comfort because of war. And that's something that I'm still navigating and kind of dissecting and understanding of the amount of trauma that came with being born in Afghanistan and living in Afghanistan. With that being said, I cherish every moment that I had with my loved ones in there, um, as well as the wonderful community I had from being at school um, to going to shopping to a nearby store or anything in between. I was brought up in a family where women's rights were valued. So my mom um, was a feminist and women rights organizer. So we from the very young age there was this understanding of our rights and our demand for equality. Given her work since the very beginning of the Taliban regime, um, I I aspired to be her. I learned to follow her footsteps, but also due to her activism, she faced constant threat by the Taliban. Um, and that was the reason we became refugee to Pakistan. I do write poetry and blogs and do a lot of public speaking events in different universities and events focused on my intersectional identity as a visible Muslim woman of color who is also a refugee. Um, and I believe that our voices should be centered when we are speaking our stories, not only when we are presented as victims, but also as those who are fighting for our own rights.
So you talked a little bit about your personal experiences and like wanting to become more like your mom and those issue areas of like being a Muslim woman and also being a refugee and a feminist and in those areas. So I'd love to hear about how those personal conceptions and those personal experiences led you to poetry and to literature and to writing. Um, Maybe just sort of like a why poetry and why now?
I was somewhere between 9 year old to 11-year old when I wrote a very short poem. And right after my mom got back from work, I was very excited to read this for her. And I was like, I'm actually writing this one poem. And there was this pride and joy surrounding us when my mom heard me read this poem. I do not remember what it was about, um, but I assume in typical family household, a child generally does write a poem at one point, and it is just a poem. The way that when we draw stuff and it's just a drawing that being handled by the refrigerator. But for my mom, it was, oh my God, you can write the way everybody in my family has been able to write, but we have all lost that talent of us during war. My mom loved poetry, loved writing creatively. However, because at the age of 19, she had to enter the workforce um, to take care of her family, who none were able to work during the Taliban regime. And prior to that, due to war and chaos, she was not able to flourish that skill of hers. Um, she realized that that talent and that skill of hers will live through me. So the following day, she got back from work with a poetry notebook for me. And I remember it had like these small drawing of fishes. I think it was like Dory and Nemo. I don't remember finding Nemo. But and I still have it. When I crossed borders, when like I got home the day that we were about to become refugees, my mom said that I'm allowed to pack up some stuff, and that was the first thing I got, and I still have it. I'm like, right now, as I'm joining this call from Georgetown University, I have this in my room. At the end of 2013, when I became a refugee to Pakistan, throughout 1 year, I experienced a variety of unfortunate events in terms of being a refugee, also being a woman in an unknown land. realizing that assault and harassment is a global issue, and the way that my intersectional identity as a refugee and as a woman collide with each other. And that was when I joined Afghan Women Writing Project, and I started mainly focusing on my identity as a woman. But I believe later on, specifically in university, I got to read like Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, and I was able to understand how each identity of mine influences the other, and how I am put at the intersection of a system of oppression. So I was easily able to understand the manners that I can bring my identity as a refugee, as a woman, as a war survivor, all in one poem and actually reflect that.
I was going to ask you, what personal experiences you choose to shine a light on in your poetry, but I think your answer sort of already gave that away, in that you it's that intersection of identity, womanhood, migration, displacement. It sounds like, as someone listening to you, it sounds like that's sort of where your art focuses. So instead of that, I'm going to ask you how you see poetry playing into social justice and into change, um, in facing that reality of those intersections of identity and that system of oppression. What do you see as the power in what you do and what you can create?
I believe poetry gives life to statistics. For so long, individuals who have survived oppression and unfortunate events and their rights have been violated for the sake of politics and for the sake of power, they have been categorized in statistic and in numbers. Poetry is able, and creative writing in general is able to give those statistics human experience. Not only that, but also individualistic view of individuals' life. Understanding that those numbers represent humans and those humans have variety of experiences is very important. For example, when we are counting data and we are saying these number of people are have become refugees to United States in this year, that's all we have about them. But when we actually sit down to listen to these people's stories, every refugee has a different story. Every migrant has a different story and with different struggles.
You've been mentioning, the fact that every person has this individual story. Is there anything from your own life that, while we're here on this call, you'd want to share? Any stories that particularly have driven your work?
There are absolutely a variety of stories and experiences that have influenced my work. I do not think that a single story can do justice to the work that I'm doing and the knowledge and the understanding that I want to convey to people. I believe that being raised by a woman um, who is a survivor and a victim of a cycle and a system that upholds patriarchy has had a huge impact on my life, but also being raised by a cycle breaker. The person who is the survivor of that cycle is my grandma, who actually helped raise me for 11 years. And being raised by the cycle breaker, my mother has been a turning point in my life. Um, and their stories, every moment of it has been um, an inspiring point of my life, whether it was my grandma ironing clothes in order to be able to send her children to school, or my mom taking me to her office for a day to be able to understand how women in a male dominant space work and how they take the space that they need and how they stand their ground. really influenced the way that I see the world. Not only that, but also being in the Western spaces and learning and understanding the way that the identities of Afghan women are portrayed has also been a really turning point for me from a very young age, since like I was 15 and I came to the United States. I have entered so many spaces where I was told that I do not have a voice, and other women can speak on my behalf because Afghan women are not supposed to have a voice. And for me, that has become a constant feather in order to be able to come forward and speak up and actually gain the platform that I need and take up as much space as possible in order to be able to tell people I do have a voice. You just choose to not listen to me. Every individual has a voice, every individual has a story, but this constant push and willingness to overtake people's story and tell an imperialist version of itself by other individuals um, have been a turning point for me, and the manners and the way that I present my story through poetry and through creative writing.
I'd love to hone in on what you said about cycle breakers and ask you what cycle you're breaking or working on breaking today and in your own life.
I think more than being a cycle breaker, I'm trying to be breaker of barriers. I came into Georgetown University to study international politics in order to understand the political world better. But international politics, the study of international politics, does not offer anything beyond the experiences that I have had. But what I'm trying to break right now is being able to have a say in the policies that are being made that impacts the children that I see myself in, that impacts those who might be 13 years old and right now trying to seek refuge in another place, leaving their home behind. While I feel like there has been different levels of fighting and cycle breaking when it comes to my grandma and my mom, experiencing immigration completely changes what I'm fighting for. It maybe I was fighting different barriers when I was in Afghanistan if I had the chance to grow up there. But being in the United States as a first generation, um, I am navigating so much. I'm balancing family. I am balancing legal field. I'm also balancing education, among many other things that I'm doing. So being able to have access to education and actually get my BA and my MA and do the work that I need to do while also ensuring that I am educating my family on their rights and navigating the system is very important. So also understanding the immigration system has been a very important part given the collapse of the Afghan government. So kind of helping to evacuate my family and fighting that and navigating that has been huge as well.
Going backwards into when we were talking about poetry as an art form and why you chose poetry, um, and your conception of your name, and that balancing of pronunciations. Since poetry is obviously like embedded in language, do you have any thoughts on like balancing, Dari, or Farsi or English and in your writing and in presenting your ideas and your thoughts and your advocacy?
For me, I used to write poetry in different languages and then translate them, um, as I thought that um, there will be a need for a specific audience of mine to actually read that poem or understand it. But something that I have recently starting to do is I do not need to separate my languages. I can actually collide them and actually use both of the languages in one poetry. Um, so that has been something that I'm trying to navigate in what specific spaces and what languages that I can use in specific poetry. So recently, I have written a poem about a conversation that I had with my grandma on how I'm losing my native language and how my R's are no longer rolling. And that was a poem that had some Farsi, some Dari, and English in it. So learning that I'm a person who speaks different languages and holds different identities, and I am not one identity at a time. I'm all of my identities at one time, and that really influences the poetry that I write at the moment because all of my language skills and abilities are with me when I write a poem. So if I'm writing about a conversation with my grandma, it is very important for me to actually reflect the way that I communicate with my grandma. Um, versus if I'm criticizing the U.S. foreign policy on Afghanistan, then that's the point where I might be writing it solely in English.
Thank you for that. I know that there's been like sort of a movement in some writers who are like bilingual in not translating their like if you use a Farsi word in a poem, not translating it immediately next to it so that I think because like the conception of like the audience as always being like a white audience that solely speaks English is kind of just a messed up concept. And I like to see writers exploring, like just letting all the identities sit with each other. So I'd love it if you could speak a little bit about Free Women Writers and your space there and the goal of your participation in that writing movement.
Free women writers, also known as دختران رابعه, um, was founded by a dear friend of mine, Nurjan Akbar. I joined Free Women Writers about a year after I became a refugee to the United States. It is a small group of Afghan women who um, who share their stories and their pain and the oppressions they experience, whether it is in Afghanistan or it is in the West or across the globe. And it is a very loving environment where we feel comfortable sharing our voices and our experiences. We work to fight um, for equality and gender justice. At times, we also write on topics that are stigmatized back home in Afghanistan, and also challenging our audience's perspective when it comes to Afghan women, whether it is in Afghanistan or across the globe. Um, yeah, and we are able to put events together and do fundraising to fund women education. But unfortunately, since the collapse of the Afghan government, we have not been able to really work together, given that we all are going through so much and we have to navigate our mental health on a daily basis. And it is very difficult and hectic to be able to do anything else except surviving on a daily basis at the moment.
That mentioning of like survival and like the hierarchy of needs and like the realities of engaging in advocacy while also being a person who's being impacted on a daily basis by what's happening around you and like the difficulties of that. We're talking about your poetry and your stories and your history. I'd love to hear what you feel like is the story that you're in right now, what story you're building in this moment.
I believe at the moment I'm surviving, whether it is writing poetry and speaking up about a specific issue or trying to write my own story. I'm surviving. I find writing and poetry to be an outlet so I can actually inhale oxygen and do not feel as guilty about it. But I also believe that while I only write at the moment to survive, it is it is a way for me to mark history and document history and what is happening. Because we see it right now, but also in a few weeks and in a few years, these statistics are gonna change and they're gonna increase, and Afghans would be again numbers at the table on sheet of paper. Also, living in the West right now at times comes with a lot of guilt. When the collapse of the Afghan government happened in August 15, I was in the United States, and I felt like I do not have a country because I was also not a citizen at the moment. And I got my citizenship 2 months later. Then all of a sudden, I was an Afghan American. So I was an Afghan in the West, in America, in a country where once it decided to leave Afghanistan after years of doing unsustainable work in Afghanistan, the collapse of the Afghan government happened. So the poor policies that played into a country that now is supposed to be my new home and my new country enabled the collapse of my motherland and the country that I have known for years now. So I'm living in a critical moment, whether it's in a critical moment in the history or in my own life, where I'm understanding what it means to be Afghan American, what it means to be an Afghan with a collapsed motherland, and what it means to be an American with sets of failed policies. And also, what are my responsibilities as an African American, and how am I going to balance these two identities, these two nationalities, and um, two passports that I have.
For our final question, I just want to know if there's any way people listening to this can support you and support your work and support the issues that you care about.
I always say if you feel like you cannot change the world, you can absolutely change someone's world. So, for the issues that I care about, when it comes to immigration, you can definitely find a neighbor around you who is an immigrant who would probably need some help with translating something or reaching out to make an appointment at some place, offering help to your neighbors who would need it, creating a safe space and a welcoming space for them, knowing that they are welcomed is very important as well. In addition to that, Afghanistan is greatly, greatly suffering right now. There has been attacks and acts of um, attempts to commit genocide and genocidal acts against Hazaras, against Shias, against different ethnicities in Afghanistan. In addition to educate yourself, also be able to help those individuals in those communities. So being able to hold a fundraising, donate the money, and crowdfunding generally helps a lot, given that we are so present in social media. So that would be a huge help, especially given the fact that also a great population of Afghanistan currently suffers from poverty due to the unemployment rate and the collapse of the Afghan government. Just about a week ago, um, a man in Kabul set himself on fire in front of his 4-year-old because he wasn't able to feed his family for so long. So helping in that manner is very important. Educating yourself and kind of breaking the stereotypes is also very important. Understanding that these individuals and Afghans and people from different minorities and the vulnerable population have a voice, and you just need to listen a little bit closer is also very important.
Thank you for being on this podcast.
Thank you for having me. The honor is mine.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can continue following Zahra's work on Instagram at ZahraZWZ. Zahra will also be launching her website in the coming weeks and hopes to publish a collection of poems in the near future. Thank you for listening. You can find Calling Others on major podcast platforms or on Win Without War's website. The music found in this episode is from Storyblocks, and this episode was produced and edited by me, Nasta Anfar, and Natalie Bettendorf. See you next time.